Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to another week of Hold My Drink. My co host today is Alan Hilton. He is the author of House United How the Church Can Save the World and the founder of the House United movement. We co founded House United Academy together. And I'm so excited, Alan. I know that you've been so busy this year trying to find out how to deal with the polarization in this world. So before we get started on that, my first question to you is what are we drinking today?
I have ginger ale today. I'm still non-alcohol because I'm trying to drop a little weight, but I'm at the ginger ale level instead of water like when we've done this before. So
Well, I mean, you have it in a wine glass, so that kind of counts a little bit.
I do. I do. I'm trying for you.
You
I'm
know,
trying.
but Alan, this is not the week for like trying to lose weight. You know that, right? Like of all the weeks that you're going to do that,
I know.
like wait 2 weeks,
I
whatever.
don't have great timing. Yeah, I don't have great timing.
So I've got just a cup of holiday cheer here because
Excellent, excellent.
it is the
I
season.
like the glass very much.
Hey, this is Spode. Spode is like the holiday like dishware.
Yeah,
Like, yeah, my mother's been giving me Spode since like I was in college, where I was like, I don't even
nice,
care about Spode,
nice.
right? I'm in college, and now I'm like, oh, I've got some Spode. I'm fancy.
That's excellent. That's excellent.
All right, so Alan, this year has been crazy. I know that you are on the front lines of dealing with polarization this year. This has been our election year. We just finally, realized, or not realized, but finally the Electoral College came together and said that indeed Biden won for the presidency. He will be our new president. But it is just, I mean, still this year we have seen, there was more turnout for Trump than a lot of people expected.
Mhm.
And I think that we are still going to deal with a lot of polarization. We dealt with a lot of polarization this year. You added pandemic on top of it. And we're going to deal with it, I think, into 2021. So our work is not done. And I just love to hear from you what you're seeing, since this is what you do on the ground in churches, with businesses, with individuals. What are you seeing? What are your concerns from what you've seen this year, and what are your highlights? What are your hopes for 2021?
Yeah, so I find people, and it's becoming different now because it's nearing Christmas, and it's not like the light goes off on polarization, but there is a a little bit more gentleness sneaking into the way people are talking to one another right now. But during the 2 months surrounding the election, the people I was working with didn't want to have conversations across red blue lines. They were avoiding the topic. They were talking about the football scores and the roads and the weather. Um, they didn't know how to, and so they were a bit scared of one another. And in their fear, they went silent, except on social media where they went vicious, right? And and so there was this sort of back and forth. The In the month since, and maybe in the 2 3 weeks since we got the electoral, well, the week since the electoral college came in, um, I I find a little less vehemence, but it may just be, as I say, Christmas related. During the year, throughout the year leading up, as we went from this is an election year, we're polarized, to this is election year and we have a pandemic in play, to we this election year we've got a pandemic in play, and the George Floyd murder just blew up. Then we went to, right, it's just been layering on, and as the campaign heated up, it got more intense. uh, in the aftermath, as the challenges in court were happening, it got more intense. This has been a year when we are just epically divided, right? And people get that, and they I get more business, but people get how hard it is now in a way they hadn't before. in the past, I've been with people who say, I don't want to have enemies in my own town. Can you help us? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Lately, there's been more of an urgency because it's not just, I don't want to dislike people. It's, I don't know how to operate around people who disagree with me. I don't know how to go to the store and see a friend I know voted differently than I did. And that, so it's really close to home for people, and it's really a vivid need right now.
So, in those instances where it's become so extreme and so polarized, where it's just like they can't even be in the same space as someone
Yeah.
different, how do you? I know that you teach around this. You teach around. You do these courageous conversations around polarization. How do you?
Right.
How do you even teach around that? If we're that polarized that we can't even be in the same breathing space, air space as someone else, how do you? What do you do?
Yeah, the odd thing is if you put it formally in play, if I get a group of 80 to 120 folks in a church, and this is obviously pre-COVID in person, but even during COVID, I've had 120 online doing conversations, in a community or in a church, and when it's formally gathered, and there are even just a modicum of rules in play, right, which is courageous conversations. I don't multiply rules and regulations. I have three rules, right? Apply the golden rule is number one, and it's amazing how far that will go. Just treat people as you'd want to be treated. Uh, Listen the way you'd want to be listened to. Speak the way you'd want to be spoken to. Not in the content, but in the manner, right? So that's rule number one. Rule number two is that we're listening for important things here. In Christian context, listen for what the Spirit is saying to the church, right? What we're not listening to grab ammunition. We're listening to see if we might find truth in what's being said. In non-Christian context, truth is the big thing we're listening for. And so so if one is golden rule, two is truth seeking, or we're listening for different reasons than we usually listen for. Three is when conflict breaks out in this 80-person room, we're going to get around those people and help them figure out how to reconcile. And between those three rules, people will talk, and they will welcome it, and they'll feel relieved afterward that there were no fatalities, right? It's sort of all of us survived, and they'll talk more to one another over coffee. So when there's a referee in play, people are willing to try. When there's not, they feel at a loss. Mm-hmm. And so organizations like Braver Angels, organizations like Narrative 4, groups, House United Academy, groups that are putting a structure around engagement are helping, but we aren't doing it often enough or habit formingly enough for it to reach into how people feel about their neighbor or their cousin for the family reunion, or however that goes.
Yeah, and then I would, that layer of COVID, where we're not in the same room, where
Right.
that filter of face to face has been like kind of stripped away. At first when all this happened, kind of late February, early March, I thought, this might be a kumbaya moment, kind of like a tragedy that brings us together, similar, sadly, to 9/11.
That lasted 30 seconds, right?
It lasted 30 seconds. It was even funny because, I'm working on my book, as you know, to the coming of, well, it's titled at the moment, To the Coming of a Better Time. And it was like, even my co-author and I, we wrote and we said, maybe we won't need this book anymore, because the book is about like, how do we have these difficult conversations? How do we come together? And literally, like, the month of March, we were like, well, gosh, should we even, like, maybe people are like, we're going to come out of this and we're all like, holding hands, and 2 weeks later it was like, oh, we had more stuff to write about than we had beforehand, and oh man,
it's nuts. It's nuts.
It's nuts.
And I think I have in my past prayed for an alien invasion, because I think having somebody come from another planet might actually draw us together. But I bet we would blame one another, right? The left would blame the right for not having you know, enough defense against extra stellar. I don't know how it would go, but but I don't even think that would work. I do think that the solution is probably more uh, integration's the wrong word. More contact, more mingle, more experience of people whom we have categorized
Mm-hmm.
because they're red or because they're blue. And I find that when people get in the same room and actually know one another, the conversation is one thing. But if we have mingled, if they realize, you know what, this person doesn't look like the classic Trumpster for me, or the classic blue person for me. This person has kind of different, is more complex than I would have expected, because
Right.
I've already stereotyped that group, and this person looks different than that. Maybe this person is the only one who's different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we make our way through to more human connectedness. I don't think it solves everything, because we've got some other structures that are a problem, but I think that's a place to begin for groups and for people. Find ways to one another. Right? I've talked with you before about Remarquet's All Quiet on the Western Front. There's a scene in it where this German killing machine, it's First World War, and a great sort of anti-war novel. But this German soldier has been trained as a killing machine. He has had the empathy trained out of him, and so he survives and he kills, and that's about all there is to him at this point in his life. And in one of the battles, he's called upon, he's ordered to go out and remove the bodies from the field and take care of the dead bodies, right, the corpses. And he goes out and he's picking up one of the men that he killed, who's a Frenchman. And out of the Frenchman's uniform comes a wallet, and out of the wallet comes a photo of the family. And and suddenly this guy starts to melt. His callousness is penetrated by the humanness of the person. There's a wife and there are kids, and his shell breaks down, and he starts to regrow an empathy. And in the novel, he then looks up the family and takes care of the widow and children in a sort of act of dramatic repentance in a way. And and I think that becomes for me an icon of one route to a solution, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we humanize one another? Well, contact is going to help, right?
Mm-hmm.
Contact won't solve everything, but it's a start, and we have access to doing that. We can find people, right?
Mm-hmm.
We know people. We can just start to connect, right? It's hard because there's freight, but
Yeah.
if we don't do that, it's going to get worse.
Well, and that's kind of another point, because you said, I know that we're outside of the election now, but there's still, I think, a lot of hard feelings on, still there's still raw, and
Right.
that before the election, you were saying people didn't even want to be in the same space as other people. And so, how to
Yeah.
get people into that space and to see, and you and I both know there are a lot of statistics out there suggesting that we are closer to a civil war than we've
Yeah.
ever been since the Civil War.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so, getting us where we've gotten to a place that we won't even get into the same space,
Yeah.
and the fact that we aren't in spaces together, and so we can kind of hide behind the anonymity of a Twitter feed, or Facebook or whatnot. um, how do you suggest that we even bring people into the same room? Because the thing is like, when you do your courageous conversations, and when I do the work with Braver Angels, we all want to be there.
Right.
We might be red, we might be blue, but we're all trying to find a solution. It's the people who aren't in the room
Right.
that
Right.
that are the ones that worry me the most. I mean, I see so much, and I'm so innovated by the fact that we've got the Braver Angels, we've got the Alan Hiltons, we've got the Heterodox Academies, and all these groups that are here on the forefront. But but again, we're all self-selecting. We all want to be
Yeah.
there. How do
That's
we
true.
reach the people who don't really will not go to the same grocery store or the same restaurant or the same whatever as someone
Yeah.
who is different than them?
Yeah, and what I don't know, that's a great question. And what I don't know is how much of a ring there is outside the current self-selecting group, right? How is it? Everybody is already self-selected. Who's ever going to care about this? I doubt that, right? I think the movement of unifying organizations is young enough that we haven't gotten very far, right? I've been at this 4 years, and it was almost empty when I started, right? Um, so I don't think we've gotten as far as to get all the people who would want to participate in that way of looking at the world. That is a unifying or a connective way of looking at the world, a bridging way. So there's still work to be done there. But you're right. There are people who will select out, people who are in that angry. It used to be you said 5% on each end or 10% on each end. It may be bigger than that now, right? But I do think working with the middle 80 is not a bad idea, because if I mean, we've talked so much about this. If we had 15, 20 years ago, if churches or any organizations had decided, you know what, we're going to keep engaging across our difference, because when we echo chamber and when we segregate, extreme animus grows, because we become less aware of one another, and therefore it spirals, right? That's a natural sociological pattern, right? But we didn't do that, and so we've already got spirals, and the number of people who have spiraled to a place where they aren't willing to talk to one another has grown, right? But if we isolate that by bringing a sort of common good mentality to the middle 80, it starts to change, right? Because there's not as much reward on the edges as there used to be. The other thing you and I have talked about before is, I think Washington moves because of votes and money. It doesn't move really. Finding states people who are keen on making a more perfect union is hard to do if votes and money aren't there. So another bit is, how do we incentivize votes and money going to people who collaborate or who engage across the aisle? How do we build the currency of Washington, votes and money, into a unity movement? Because right now it's on the edges. Usually money and votes, money especially, comes from people who are out a ways on the edge,
Well,
by statistically.
you've said something before, and if you can repeat it here, because I think this was really insightful. You think that a lot of this we started to separate with Newt Gingrich's era. Can you explain like the
Yeah,
origins
yeah.
as you see it? Because I thought that was very insightful.
So there are a couple things, causes that usually don't come up when I'm talking to groups on their own. Usually they'll name things like social media and Fox News and MSNBC and all those things. I can draw those out, but a couple things that don't come out. One is the end of the Cold War, right? The end of the Cold War produced produced the end of all being on one side in the communist capitalism, or in the in the other kind of red, and red, white, and blue war, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we didn't have a common enemy, we started to fight each other. G.K. Chesterton's famous line, or my favorite of G.K. Chesterton's line, is, it's in the middle of the afternoon when all the food has been eaten and all the toys have been played with, that the children begin to torture the cat, right? We just don't have enough to do. We don't have an enemy, so we start to pick on one another, right? But the other one, and this is the one I think you're referring to. So Bill Clinton is elected in fall of 1992. After 2 years in office, they have a Republican takeover of the House, the Gingrich Revolution, and it produced an opposition to Clinton. And in that, by the way, some good law got made because they had to compromise, but that's another conversation. When he became leader, um, he Newt Gingrich did something you and I might have done. It seems a good idea. He said, "Let's not live in Washington and be Washington soaked people. Let's go live in our districts because then we understand our folks and represent them better, raise better money, all those things." All of that is very logical. However, the collateral damage of that was that suddenly Republicans and Democrats were no longer going to their children's soccer games together, or to the opera together, or just having a beer together, or right. They were no longer interacting at all except on the field of battle, in the arena, so to speak, and that made it so they were more able to be inhumane toward one another and toward one another's ideas. So on a political level, in a elite level of the people who make our laws, that was a huge dynamic, a huge change. I think one of the things, sometimes when you and I get to talking, or when people who are of our ilk get to talking, we start to, one could imagine from listening to us that we want everybody in conversation with somebody who thinks differently from them all the time, right? That we would love for red blue neighborhoods to break out, and you don't get to sit next to a blue person. If you're a blue person, you have to, that we've got this sort of full court press of unity. But I find that we need time in our group, and we need to hear the way we view the world echoed back to us sometimes, right? And so one of the questions for organizations that are working on this, for people who are processing it spiritually or psychologically, is how do we measure in that alternation? How do we spend enough time with people with whom we agree to actually be able to know that voice and bring that voice with its strengths into the conversation on the one hand, and then how do we know when we're supposed to mix it up on the other hand? And one of the best images I've seen for that really helped me. Edgardo Colon Emmerich is the leader of I think he's the director of the Center for Reconciliation at Duke Divinity School. And he's a Latino theologian who I got to hear him speak at Duke's Summer Institute for Reconciliation a few years ago. And he gave this great analogy that I commend to you and to your listeners. He said, I look at ethnic ministries the way I look at section rehearsals in a choir or in a symphony. And we all sat there as he spoke it and just kind of tilted our heads. And he said, no, listen to me. He said, I work with Latino communities, and I tell them they're like the alto section in a choir, because we're all part of this big choir. Let's call it the union, right? The American culture. We're all part of this big choir, but there are dominant voices in the choir. Let's call them the sopranos. And if we just spent all of our time together, everybody's voice would accommodate the melody line, the soprano voice. So we need to send, in a choir, we send altos out and basses out and tenors out and sopranos out so they can get their line strong, right? So they know, and it's internalized, and they've got it, so that when they get out into the fray, they bring it fully and it produces the proper harmony, right? But we don't have section rehearsals in order to stay in sections. That is, that's not the terminal destination, right? We're learning our part so that we can bring it into the whole, and the whole works better, right? So by analogy, I think that we need time. If you're an evangelical Christian, or if you're a progressive Christian, or if you're a left-wing radical, or if you're right, all of the different voices, that if we brought them all together would help us build a more perfect union, right? all of those need to be defined and learned and have their articulation and clarity, but they can't stay there, or else the whole ball club suffers. The whole symphony, the whole choir just doesn't work, right? We need the altos and sopranos and tenors and to go with the basses. We need the right and the left and the middle, and we need the different voices to then come back into the big conversation, right? I think that's when we get better.
No, I like that. I like that. I guess the question is, though, as I love that analogy. I think that's a fabulous analogy of how we can come together in harmony. But I think that kind of what might flip that, or not flip it, but kind of throw a wrench in that analogy is with social media. We can get lost in our own echo chambers and stay there. And I know I've talked to so many people, friends that I have on both sides of the political spectrum, and the honest ones will say, when I'm fearful or when I'm angry or frustrated, I dig deeper in to my own network. And so I like the idea. And I've been talking to some other people though who, and in Braver Angels does this too, where how do we talk amongst ourselves,
right?
And that goes to a point where when I was saying earlier, how do we bring in the people who aren't already self-selected into this conversation? I mean, maybe that is the first start, is where if we're talking amongst ourselves, there's a comfort level, people open up a little bit more, and then it's just like it starts to move towards the whole choir, if you will. But at the same time, I just see there is also the opportunity for us to be stuck in these echo chambers, and I think that social media makes that really hard. And so as you and me who are trying to break out, and I get it, and I don't disagree at all that we should maybe start to have these conversations among our own kind, whether that's political, whatever our peoples are, our tribes.
Right.
But that transition is where I'm still fuzzy. Like, how there needs to be, and maybe that's what we need to start working on. Like, we need to have transition makers. Is that even a word? Like, because that's where we get stuck.
Yeah, and that there is a, I guess the young woman who is a young woman who was named Time Person of the Year or Young Person of the Year or something, who has put together an app for social media that if you put it in play for yourself, it detects bullying, it detects harsh language, and it doesn't shut it down, right? It doesn't censor it. It feeds back to the user to say, do you really want to use these words, right? And that alerted me, I just read about that recently, that alerted me to the notion that we might be able to tap the kinds of code writers and algorithm formers who have built social media and ask, is there a challenge app that we could install? So if I've chosen, you go to Target online or to Amazon online, and they say, if you like this, you might also like that, right? It's a sameness algorithm, right? If you like this writer who is conservative, you might like that writer who's conservative, but it makes the assumption that I always want to hear the same voices, right? Building into social media a challenge algorithm in which you've read 3 straight staunch conservatives. How about trying a right? Just even puts on offer the notion that maybe all people don't want to stay in their cave. Maybe we don't really want to stay in echo chambers. And your friend is right, or the people you were referring to are right. Sometimes we need comfort food, but comfort food being the sound of our own voice brought through other people, right? But we don't always need that. And some people get up on the side of the bed some days when they say, you know what, I'm brave today. And I think Braver Angels has a good name. Let's see, what's the history of that name? Um, uh,
It was
it,
Better Angels from
yeah,
Abraham
and I
Lincoln.
like. I at first I hated that they had to move
Yeah.
from that because Better Angels quotes Lincoln, but braver angels, we could use
Yeah.
some courage now and then. I
Yeah.
call mine courageous conversations, right?
Right.
If we tap that and say, if you're brave, right, which may summon some interest, yeah, I'm brave. If you're brave, you might even want to use this app and hear somebody you disagree with. There are ways that we can creatively enter that market and call out virtue, right? Summon, not call out as in throw down.
Right.
Um,
Summon.
Summon
I like
virtue.
that word.
You know,
Summon.
try to evoke in people.
Yeah.
It's like remarque, right? Try to evoke in people the part of them that actually wants to connect humanly, right? And let's name the degree of difficulty. It's a very hard thing right now. It's why people went silent during the election cycle, right? But it's not impossible. It's a habit, and we've broken other habits, right? So if we can get help technologically to break the habit, and we can get help from communities that start to nurse up this call to bravery, right, and courage, we can turn the boat around. It's just got some inertia. It's got some momentum that's hard to change.
Oh, I love that idea of a challenge algorithm.
Yeah.
Like Siri,
Yeah.
that is so smart. That is so smart. I
Yeah.
wow. I'm gonna have to look that up. So actually, send that to me because I'll put that in our notes because
Yeah. So
that's brilliant.
I the young woman who was Times Person of the Year did this relative to bullying and so the manner in which we speak to one another. She didn't quite go around to if you're blue, you might want to read this red thing, but it's of the same ilk, right? It's
Yeah.
saying, you know what, I don't think people really want to be as mean as they are. You've watched the TED Talk of Dylan Marone. Dylan Marone is this content producer, internet content producer, who when the comments page comes out on his content and somebody has just brutalized him, he's savvy enough to find out that person's information and even find out what their phone number is. And so he calls them,
Yeah.
right? And this is a guy who is out there and vulnerable in the world. And he calls them and says, I saw your comment and I'd just like to hear you more about it.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people, I mean, some hang up, but a lot of the people, when they talk to him, say, man, I thought I was coughing with nobody to hear, right? We have that sense of social media and they engage. And some of them say, I'd like to talk more, right? And that kind of courage is one thing, but also it identifies the fact that there are a lot of people out there who don't realize they're going down the slippery slope. They haven't quite felt it. They haven't had anything recoil in them, like having Dylan Marone call and realize I was saying that to a human. But we could put ways in play for that to happen more often.
I love it. It sounds like we've got to talk some business plans. I'm almost done with my drink, so let me ask you one last question for today. We'll talk challenge algorithms.
Yeah.
And another on a private line where. But what are your biggest hopes and fears for 2021, and what are you going to do to work towards a better future? You, Alan.
That's a hopeful, good question. So one of it's going to have two parts to the answer. One, and this is toss off, but one part of the answer is I've taken more work that is on the race line, kind of the divide between races and between people who believe differently about how race ought to be engaged in politics and culture. Because I think when I started House United 4 years ago, I thought I could isolate red-blue politics, and I saw people doing racial justice. I saw nobody doing red-blue stuff, so I jumped in. But that was a fallacy relative to being able to isolate, because in the United States, race and politics are inseparable, right? you know this because you've done so much work in bringing people into conversation and getting them writing letters to one another, and your writing is going to do that more. So I am going to hope for some progress in that area and try to invest in that. But in the red blue realm that we've spent most of our time on, Albert C. Brooks says something in his Love Your Enemies book. He tells the story of his dad, who, when he was a kid, Albert C. Brooks was doing what he did. He was a conservative in a liberal household, right? And his parents were 60s liberals, and he was a conservative somehow. And
yeah, that's weird. It's usually the opposite, but go on.
Well, yeah, it's kind of lovely. But Albert C. Brooks said his dad used to tell him, it really doesn't take much courage to speak out loudly among people who speak out loudly in the same direction you do, right? Activism of a kind that gathers people who will agree, it doesn't take much courage. What takes courage is talking kindly about somebody on the other side in your group, right? We've talked about echo chambers in this conversation. I hope that wise, courageous, virtuous folks in both the red camp and the blue camp in 2021 can stand up and say, no, you're all wrong about them. I know 57 of them, and not a one sounds exactly like what you're saying, right? That within the chamber, we start to talk about the other humanely, right? And start a little bit of a recoil against the spiral, right? So it's not just let's get red and blue talking to one another. It's how we talk about the other when we're in our section rehearsal, right? When we're in our chamber. And I think there's room for brave and virtuous people to undertake that. And so that's one of the things I'm going to try to cultivate. I'm going to write a bit about it.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. I'm all in. Challenge. We're doing a challenge algorithm, and we are doing section choirs in 2021.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. We're doing both those things. And we can hope for good things. It's a habit. We can break it. Polarization is a habit. We just have to work hard to break it.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of stuff. Yeah, it's great to talk to you. Thank you for having a drink with me.
It's been you finished yours. I haven't finished mine.
Here's to.
I mean, I talk too much.
Here's to our 2021.
Yes, thank you, Jen.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.